Welcome to the NLP Talks podcast, bringing you inspirational stories along with a good dose of potentially life-changing NLP strategies. I'm Laura Evans, multi-award-winning NLP trainer, and I'm on a mission to help you unleash your potential in business and life. I'm so glad you're here. Pull up a chair, listen in, and let's get started on revealing more about this transformational NLP toolkit. Hey, how you doing? I hope you're safe and well. Thank you so much for tuning in for another episode of the NLP Talks podcast. I can't wait to reveal that today's episode is a little bit different because we're going to be talking about neurodiversity and neuro inclusivity. Today's guest is Jennifer Griffiths. Now, Jennifer is a master NLP practitioner and a master coach. And when I first met her, she was a senior HR professional in business. Now, that isn't what she does now, at least not in part, because in this episode, she is going to share her own personal journey to getting her own diagnosis, how she had to do that, how there was a lack of support afterwards, and how, in her words, nothing changes, yet everything changes at that moment in someone's life. She shares her experiences, the experiences of the many people she's spoken to as part of her research, because Jen is now a specialist coach working with people with neurodiversity. In this episode, she talks about how we all want to fit in and belong, and isn't that so true? However, how when you are neurodivergent, you are essentially carrying a huge load. And we talk about labels, masking, and how batteries just deplete so much quicker with someone that is neurodivergent. We then talk about terminology, because I asked Jen very openly about the fact that I'm very new to this myself and I'm here to learn too. And I wanted her to give me some advice and some ideas about terminology that I shouldn't use. We talk particularly about workplaces because this is where Jen specializes. She works with organizations, HR departments, companies, and individuals to support them all through the neurodiversity journey. I love the fact that Jen talks about wanting to create a neuro-inclusive environment for people and the Ripple program, which she has created. It sounds absolutely fascinating. And at the end of the episode, she talks about 6 top tips for NLP coaches. So it doesn't matter if you are a parent, a life partner, a child of someone that has been on this journey, you're going to find this episode really insightful. If you're an HR professional, a leader in business, a business owner, or a coach, you're also going to go away with such nuggets that will help inform how you move forward. I absolutely loved my conversation with Jen, and I know you're going to love listening to it. So without further ado, let's go across where I start by asking Jen to share her journey with all of us. When I first met you, you were full-time working as an HR professional in senior roles in organizations. And at that time, I'm not aware that you were aware that there was this whole neurodiverse piece to your life. And I'm curious to understand a little bit about the journey that you've been on, because I will be the first to say I have a very, very little bit of knowledge about neurodiversity. So I'm here to learn as much as anybody else is on this episode. And I'm just curious to understand, because I know that it's not something that just like happens overnight. Like if someone's neurodivergent, it's going to have been for a while. So I'm going to shut up and I'd love to hear your journey, Jen, about how you discovered your own diagnosis and how it impacts you day to day.
Course. So, neurodivergence is a neurodevelopmental condition. So you're born with it, you've got it all your life. And as you said, I didn't know that I was, which sounds a bit mad, really, because I think that's one of the things people really struggle to get their heads around. Well, how could you not know? I mean, without going through my life story, I think when it comes to, let's pick up from where you met me, that's a really good place. So I was a HR professional on the surface, had everything together. You'd never know that anything was really going on for me. But I think, I knew that I worked harder than other people. I did know that. But I just thought that was me and my makeup. And, it was just one of those things that I lived with. And I actually got, I had a period of, they call it burnout, I think, probably in my mid 30s. And one of the things what kind of came to light then was that I knew I was working really hard, but it was those, like anyone who's got burnout, neurodivergent or not, it was that buildup of lots of things in your life. And I hit a wall and I had a period off work. And, that's part of the journey. And it's important to mention because after that, I resolved never to let that happen again. And I was just, really, really, there's a fire in me. I pursued this whole well-being lifestyle. I consumed books and practices and, really worked hard to stop that ever happening to me again. And then actually what happened was about a year and a half ago, my dad got a diagnosis for autism and he's 67. So that was really interesting because I was a little bit wary of that. And I did think to myself, and I'll be totally honest, why bother? Like, what's the point in getting a diagnosis at that age? What's it going to do? And I started kind of talking to him more about it. And I read his report from the doctor. And I thought, oh my, this sounds exactly like me. And I'd also at the same time started struggling a little bit again with burnt out. And my partner actually said to me, oh, I read this thing the other day about ADHD. I really, really, really think you need to look more into it. It sounds like a lot of it could be you. And I think if you talk to a lot of people about it, they'll say the same thing. Like you read it on the symptoms, you think, oh, that could be me. But I did that, went off and thought, right, I'm going to go and explore this because it ignited my curiosity. And so I went off and did that. I was still working as a HR professional. Again, on the surface, everything was fine. You'd never really know. Always been a bit anxious and a bit of a stress head. And I got diagnosed with chronic anxiety, actually, or, after I had the first stage of burnout. So anyway, yeah, long story short, too late. I basically got to a point where I got my diagnosis and it was really weird. Really strange feeling because, and if you talk to people who've had that diagnosis, they'll say pretty much the same thing, which is nothing changes, yet everything changes. That's how I like to put it, because suddenly you start to see new things in yourself. You start to understand yourself better. You get no support after your diagnosis at all. So you don't get anything. You just get told that you've got this diagnosis and you're left to go away and kind of explore it yourself. So it was a really weird time for me. As it happened professionally, unfortunately, I ended up burning out again and had some time off work fairly recently towards the end of last year. And that was when I really started to explore it because I'd said, I'm never going to let this happen again. It's happened again. I didn't know, because you don't get any support after the diagnosis, that actually burnout and neurodivergence pretty much go hand in hand. And a lot of people experience it really regularly. And it's quite a common part of life. And so that was my journey, if you like. I mean, I know, there's probably lots more to it, but the point is that that's what got me to really get into, well, I'm feeling like I've got no support. I have to figure this out myself. How can I help other people with all my coaching and mentoring experience, HR experience that I've got? What can I do to make this better in the world? And that's where I came up with the concept of ThinkDiff. And I left my job at the end of last year and started ThinkDiff. So that's pretty much the story.
I just think it's one of those things that I think is happening more and more and more. I mean, to give one example, my neighbour's daughter has just realised that she thinks she probably has autism, has never been diagnosed, has been through the whole education system. No one has ever picked up on it. There were things that she struggles with. And it's only when her mum, who is not trained in this at all, sits her down one day and says, have you ever thought about this? And then there's this massive release and this burst of tears and emotion. And then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, actually, maybe you're right. And then she goes on to have a conversation with her best friend. He goes, well, I did try to have this conversation with you a year ago, but you laughed it off, And so it's interesting listening to your story and the very recent experience I've had with a close friend of mine. And you just think, oh my goodness, this is happening to so many people. Can I just take you back though and ask you a few questions? And you can feel free to say, no, I'm not answering that if you absolutely want to. I know you're a fairly open book. So when your partner said to you, she'd read an article about ADHD and then came to you and said, have you thought about this? And all that must have been quite a challenging moment. I can only try to imagine what it would be like when someone comes to you and says, is this you? And that whole emotional processing thing, you know, like, was it a shock to you or a relief to you, or how do you think?
It's a really good question. I'd say more than anything, a relief, because this is, and going back to your previous point, actually, it leads on nicely. So a lot of girls go undiagnosed because the criteria and the research has all been done on boys. And so the diagnostic criteria for autism and ADHD, and if you think of ADHD, we all think of the classic, you know, in the 90s, it came up in the press quite a lot, you know, the classic naughty boy at school type scenario. And that has really, really not helped the situation when it comes to lots of girls slipping through the net. And what then happens, and I say happens, I'm talking from my experience, but I know that this has happened to a lot of clients and a lot of people I've spoken to, is because girls are so adept at masking and fitting in socially, that's a double reason that they get missed. And so you get to a point in your life where you've tried everything. You are desperate. You've been diagnosed with anxiety. You've been diagnosed with maybe depression. A lot of people bipolar, borderline personality disorder is another quite common one. Medicated, given things and stuff to try that's not worked, and you're desperate. So when I had that conversation, I was like, oh my God, what if I am finally, I'm so tired of everything. I'm working so hard. This really could be something that could really help me. And it was mainly relief it was. And a lot of the relationship friction maybe we'd ever had would have been down to that as well. I won't go into it, but it's like things like just general stuff. Like, you know, I've never been, a lot of any conflict was around my inability to be tidy. Let's just leave it there. An example.
My partner is neurodivergent. She's dyslexic. And that's a challenge because, like, sometimes I forget. I don't wish to be short, or, you know, when she says, but Laura, it takes me a long time to learn things. And it's hard. It must be just so hard if you don't know that that's part of the way that your brain works. And it's not that you're wrong. It's not that you can't. It's not that you're not capable. It's just your brain works different.
There's some really great things that come out of it, but there are some challenges. And don't we all want to belong? Don't we all want to be understood? And so, you know, that is really the key here, is that it can give you that. Yeah. And that's just so empowering when you've gone, for me, 43 years of just not really knowing. So, yeah.
There's a few things you've mentioned. Every time you say something, I'm like, oh, I must ask her about this. Now, I want to talk a bit about masking, because this is a word that comes up a lot in the arena of neurodiversity. And if I'm honest, I'm not sure I really understand what that means. I can have an educated guess. So could you explain a bit about what is masking and how does that impact people?
Yeah, of course. And so again, I just want to make the point that it's not just skills that mask, obviously, but they're just more adept at it. It's thoughts. So yeah, it's, in essence, it's pretending. So going back to what I mentioned earlier, we all want to fit in and belong. And so what you tend to do, and certainly my experience, you know, I was a very weird kid. I was a very active kid. They reckon that specifically with ADHD, by the age of 12, I think it is, I'd have to kind of look at the exact numbers. Someone with ADHD has had 20,000 more negative signals coming at them for who they are and how they act than someone who isn't. And so what tends to happen then, especially as you go into the realms of secondary school, where you're a little bit more on your own and more independent, you've already learned to mask and pretend to fit in. And by that time, you start to go, oh, okay, you know, I really do need to mask to fit in now, because it starts to get a bit more real. And that becomes a bit of a habit. So you kind of don't know what you're pretending and what you're not to do. as an example, looking people in the eye, I don't find that comfortable at all. But I learned to look here. Now, you might go, okay, well, that's not that much effort, whatever. But then when you bring in sensory stuff as well, so loud noises, smells, things that really, really affect you. Plus, the world isn't designed for neurodivergent people. And so you have to pretend, camouflage to basically not look weird. You want to fit in. So you suppress things. You suppress stims. So stimming is basically something that helps people to regulate. And, you suppress all of that stuff because it's pretty weird if you sat there. One of mine is I make a little noise and then do a double click. If I did that in public, I'm obviously gonna feel some judgment with it. So you just do all of this stuff coming at you, trying to slow down your brain, trying not to interrupt people, trying to remember how to socially interact because you have to learn the rules because you don't know them and they're really hard to learn. All of that stuff lends itself to masking, basically. And it's a huge load to carry.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Just for the purpose of people listening to the podcast, when she said, I can't look people in the eyes, but I look here, she pointed between her eyes above her nose. So if you're listening to this and you didn't see, just so that you know.
I remember moments really, after you get the diagnosis and you do a bit of autopsy on your life. And so it's really strange because all these memories start to play and you're like, oh yeah. So I didn't understand sarcasm. I didn't really understand social rules. And quite often I found it really difficult being around other girls. I ended up kind of making friends with boys and playing sports because A, I could get my energy out, but B, I could get away from more of the social interaction because boys are a bit more like, oh, all right, how you doing type, rather than wanting to have like a deep and meaningful conversation necessary at that age. So I found myself drawn to different people at different times in my life, depending on, where I was in the context. But I remember eventually what happened was I went from being this loud, outrageous, active kid to just going in on myself. And to the point where my family, I think it was about my early teens, there was whispers of, should we take her to go and see somebody because she doesn't speak? Because it was easier for me not to speak and to just be not heard and to really suppress everything than to be myself.
Wow.
And that's massive.
That's huge. That's huge. I mean, I'm thinking about someone else I know at the moment who has also recently had a diagnosis of ADHD, and this is a teenager at school. And this again, a girl in this example, but again, I'm not saying it's not for the boys too, but this is a girl. Again, she is 16, just about to take her GCSEs, and she has only just had a diagnosis. And this is a child who has been through the education system and has been put in isolation because she fidgets in the classroom. She has had reports to her parents about her misbehaviour. She got put into reflection, as they now call it. And I was horrified because they took her, because she was playing with her hair and flicking a pen, they took her out of an actual school class at secondary school, put her in reflection during the taught class on her own so she could reflect on her behaviour. I was horrified to hear that. And her parents have just fought for her to have a diagnosis. She's just been diagnosed with ADHD. I know everybody's kicking themselves because they're like, look, this is why she behaves the way that she is, and she also has done a great job at trying to fit in. She looks like every other girl in her friendship group, even though that's probably not her. And as I'm listening to you talk, I'm like, wow, that's not unusual. That's
pretty much what it's like from day dot. You get all these, like I said, the world isn't built for that. I mean, the education system in particular, I thought really naively when I got diagnosed, I thought, oh, well, at least like the younger generation are getting support, because you do have a bit of anger that kind of comes out because you're a little bit angry at the world and you kind of think, well, why? Well, I feel like this. I feel so awful that like, why couldn't I be understood earlier, And it is a little bit like that. So in part of my research, I've done a lot of research. I've done lots of one-to-one bits of research because I really want to understand the topic. And I met with a couple of like 15, 16-year-olds. I was so shocked at their experiences. I thought that at the very least they would have support. No. So they get diagnosed, no support for the parents, no support for the kids. I heard stories of the one person, all they got was like a tutor almost that sat with them in the classroom, like one-to-one support. That's it. That's the only thing they had. No one's ever sat with them. I was talking to this one individual about careers because their family wanted me to talk to them about careers. And their family were kind of desperate to try to understand the person better. And I talked to them and I said, how does it play out for you, your diagnosis? And they couldn't answer me. And I thought that was just me. So, of course, you've masked all this time up to like later on in life and you think, who am I? What's really me? What's not me? You start to act maybe a bit more neurodivergent and people around you are like, okay, this is a bit sus. So suddenly you're acting autistic, are you? And this honestly is so complex. It's so complex. And talking, teachers, you've got some good schools with good support, but in the main, and if you look at the majority of environments, then going all the way from school, all the way up to university and then into the workplace, it's the same. It's not built for, there's just no understanding at all. And actually, I think that's what's given me the passion to work on this stuff, because you can change so many lives and change the world through, like, even if you touched, in my lifetime, if I could work with 10 people and make their life better, I'd be happy. Well, one, but you know what I mean. I just think that's like why it's so important.
I mean, we're going to come and talk about the workplace in a second, because I know that's what you're passionate about. But if a parent was listening to this podcast episode and they think that their child might be neurodivergent or they've had a recent diagnosis, I mean, I'm guessing you probably brimming full of top tips and things like that. But if there was a couple of things you could give a parent in that situation, what would you say?
Genuinely, I would say help them understand themselves. So after the diagnosis, work with them to understand how it plays out. And there's lots of tools you can use for that. I use a diagnostic tool I've done myself, not to diagnose people, by the way, but to help them to understand how their symptoms affect their life, because every single individual is different. Just because you're autistic, it doesn't mean you've got a common set of traits. You're different to every other autistic person. So it's really helping them understand themselves. And if you can do that early enough, they will start to unmask. And it's about helping them to do that. And yes, you've still got to set boundaries and you've still got to parent. But actually, when they understand themselves more, you'll find that your relationship with them gets a lot better anyway. And the other thing I always say, I don't coach teenagers. Get a coach.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's almost like that's my go-to, really. I just think about coaching and how amazing it is and what it's done for me in my life. And, it's been a lifesaver for the coaches and mentors I've had. And actually, if you go back, if I'd had that earlier, very different story, I'd imagine.
I want to move on and talk about labels. Now, I've got some views on labels, but I want your view, because I've been thinking about this over the last week since our initial chat about this podcast. And it's actually interesting. The more I've reflected on it, the more I'm thinking, So my view has always been labels are simply a convenience that allow us to communicate with one another. So if we both talk about a red bus, in our head, we both know what a red bus is. All right. Whether it's a double-decker up London bus or if it's just a bus down the road, we have an idea about what we're talking about. So I think labels are a convenience, and I think that's how I've always viewed them with my NLP hat on. And I struggle sometimes with labels in the sense that when someone gives themselves a label, it sometimes then means our unconscious mind acts out that label. And that it's not always necessarily helpful. So for example, if someone gives themselves a label that they're a naughty kid, then all of a sudden, they give themselves permission for that kind of behavior to become exaggerated, for example. So, but what I do see value in labels is that convenience of at least us understanding a little bit about what we're talking about. But some people wear labels as badges of honours. Some people wear them as excuses. Some people wear them as a helpful way of communicating. And the one thing I was thinking about since we last spoke was that I actually wonder in this era of neurodiversity whether labels actually have a different benefit. And that is to the outside world, not to the individual. Because if all of a sudden you go out and say, I've got ADHD, what happens, I'm guessing, is other people change how they interact with you. But I've never had that, so I don't know. Is there benefit in the whole label thing? Because when you're an individual, let's say you've always struggled at work, and then all of a sudden you go to work and say, I've been diagnosed with ADHD or I've been diagnosed with autism, I'm guessing that changes how people interact with you. But again, it's not me, so I don't know. Anyway, that's my ramblings on labels. Over to you. Talk to me about labels and neurodiversity, both with your HR hat on, but also with your individual hat on.
Yeah, and I agree with a lot of what you've said. So I do think labels can be used as something that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy sometimes. And one of the things I loved about your going on the NLP practitioner and master prac courses was that. So I loved that whole exploration of how do we, it's a limiting belief. You're setting yourself up to have this, it feeds that in some way. But actually, there's a couple of reasons I think is beneficial. I don't actually think people treat you differently. What I think it does give you, in fact, it's actually quite sad because the lack of knowledge on this, you're often met with fear and misunderstanding rather than, that's probably how you get treated differently. People distance themselves from you in a lot of cases. Not always. And like I said, in my intimate relationships and with my family, it's really helped. You see us all at Christmas time now, half of us are neurodivergent. And because it does run in families and we all laugh about it now. And I'm a little bit more tolerant of some things. So that does help with your close relationships. Workplaces, anything outside of that, mixed reactions. So actually it's really scary for people to actually even say it out loud because they know they're going to likely get that reaction. I was lucky, but some people get poor reactions off their loved ones and close ones as well. Going back to what you said about a parent going, I feel really guilty about the fact that my daughter didn't get diagnosed with ADHD. Parents often feel a lot of guilt. So it's about them as well. So when you say I'm autistic or I've been diagnosed with autism, there's a lot of guilt for that parent, especially if they're a later diagnosed adult, because they think, if I'd known that, maybe I could have supported them better, potentially. So it's complex, but what I would say is what it does help with. So I always think of neurodivergent individuals as, we've all got our batteries. So the load on us, masking, sensory stuff, how our brains work, not designed for the world, we work really hard. There's a big load on us. So our batteries will deplete quicker. And what it does is the label almost takes a little bit of the load off yourself, if that makes sense, because you go, right, I know I can suddenly be more myself. And you start to look around you and create more of a life and an environment in your home and your workplace that suits you. Because you were struggling, but you pretended you weren't struggling, and it was really hard work, and you'd be misdiagnosed, and you're at the end of your tether, and you're desperate. So it's really can be helpful as well for individuals, and I think that's the slight difference with this from my experience and from the clients that I work with.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, and that's why I want to ask the question, because I'm fascinated as to how that would work. And I guess I'm in that place that goes, students in the training room have always said to me, Laura, what's your advice if a coaching client comes to me and says, I'm neurodivergent, I've got autism, I've got ADHD or whatever, what do you do? My response has always been, ask the individual what they need from you, because everybody is different. And I'm just curious, Jen, if you'd been sat in that training room and someone had come up to you and said that, because you're an experienced master coach and obviously you're now a specialist in neurodiversity, what would you have said? What's your kind of reaction to that?
So I agree with you. I think that, so there's a saying, if you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. So everyone's got specific needs. That's the same for everyone. And true neurodiversity is about every single brain in across the world, So it's basically the diversity in human minds anyway. And I think, we could all do with a bit of what you need. So I think that's a really great start, because it's about understanding how everyone's unique brain works. But when it comes to someone who's diagnosed with a neurodivergent condition, it's really, it's a good question. The only caveat I'd add is, so back to what we were talking about with the teenagers I interviewed, same with the adults that I work with, because of masking, and this is the complexity, we don't always know what we need. And it depends where you are on your journey. Some of us do, some of us don't. I now do. But if you'd asked me, when I kind of told my workplace, that's the first question they asked me. They were great, really supportive. It was like, what do you need? I was like, I don't know. And I couldn't find any resources to send them to help them to understand me, because all the resources are general. They're not about me. They were general stuff. And so, this is why coaching is amazing, because, or like getting to know people and asking the questions is amazing, because if you've built that rapport with the person, hopefully, and the trust, they'll say, I don't know, but can I just let you know as we go along? And it's giving that permission for them to be able to speak to you and have the trust and the open conversation that if they don't know, that's okay. But actually, as long as you keep the conversation going and they feel comfortable enough to say, oh, you know what? Yesterday, when we did this in the training room, actually, I did feel a bit uncomfortable. Can we discuss it? And then having that open dialogue about what they might need is really useful.
Now, we're going to come on in a bit to top tips for coaches that have neurodivergent clients, but I just want to stop to talk about what you're doing to help people that are have been diagnosed and that are looking to get their heads around their diagnosis, and particularly in the workplace. Now, but even before we do that, sorry, I've just had a brain idea. Terminology. Can we just talk a little bit about terminology? Because one of the things that I know people are fearful of is saying the wrong thing, right? Yeah. When someone comes to them and says, I have this condition, is it a condition? Is it like, what language do we use? And how do we do, because no one wants to offend anybody. People want to be supportive, but give me some top tips around language. Like, how do I not put my foot in it accidentally without knowing it? Does that make sense?
It makes loads of sense. I got loads of examples of what not to do. But
give us what not to do, and then give us
basically don't assume, but and really think about stereotypes and seek to understand. If somebody comes to you and says in your life, your workplace, your training room, that they've got a condition, like you said, it's about asking them and building that trust. But also, I went to an event recently and somebody asked me what I did. It was a networking event, and I explained what I did, and they said, "Oh, are you autistic then?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Oh, but you can look me in the eye." And so there's like these common misconceptions, and I explained, and it was a good I see it as an opportunity to help me explain things, so I'm really open with it, and I see it as exactly that. But yes, I guess it's like when Rain Man has not really done anyone any favors, I don't think, when it comes to autism and what people think about it. And actually, it's just back to asking. So some people, there's so many. I was laughing when you said it, because honestly, there's so many, everyone's got different preferences. The other day, spot on what you said about calling it a condition. Somebody said it's not a condition. And if you look at the social model of disability, that basically says that it's that society has labeled things as a disorder, and has the reason that it's a disorder or a disability is because there's barriers in the way put there by society to make it so, if that makes sense. And I don't want to go too deep into that because you could talk about it for ages. But the point is that, when you look at how you use the language, don't be afraid to make mistakes and actually say, look, I'm new to this. I know that, like anything in life, people have got preferences about how we might discuss it. If I make a mistake, please correct me. It's not, it's through, I want to learn. And it's that whole bit around, working in HR, we get that all the time, where especially when something starts to become more prevalent in the workplace, mental health was really big about 10 years ago. You saw mental health first aiders getting trained up all over the place. And it became, rightly so, a huge topic in businesses. And, people were scared to say the wrong thing then as well. And I think it's back to, like, I'll advocate this all day long, human to human approach. What would you do if it was like, what would you want someone to say to you? We all make mistakes in our language, and it's really about opening it up and saying, look, I might do that. And if I do, please correct me. And what do you prefer to be referred? How do you prefer me to refer to this? And getting that right at the beginning.
Let's talk a bit about the work that you're doing, because I totally hear from what you've already said in this episode that the diagnosis is the first step. And when someone's got a diagnosis, there ain't no help afterwards. And so people then have a diagnosis and then they're like, okay, so someone else has told me I'm autistic, or someone else has told me I've got ADHD, or someone else has told me I've got Asperger's, or, and then there's nothing. And I know that you specialize in helping people in the workplace. So can you give us a flavour of the type of support that you provide, the type of support that a neurodivergent person may need after that in terms of work and work life?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, the big thing is a lot of people don't even want to tell their organisations because they're fearful of the repercussions and the stigma associated with it. And so quite often, that's why I kind of got two arms to what I do, because for me to make a true impact, I have to look after the needs of the individual. So I'm very person-centered. And I would, the people that I work with, I'll help them work on themselves first. So what is it? How does this show up for you? What is it? Let's think about, and we'll look at this diagnostic wheel I talked about, discovery wheel, and we'll look at whatever, the diagnosis is, and we will basically look at how it's affecting them in their life. And actually, some things, it's a little bit different it's like a little wheel of life I use. So you've basically got a rating scale and you can score yourself in the different areas. And I'll explain what those are and explain the clinical the detail behind it so people understand what it means. And then they'll score themselves. And it gives you this really lovely pictorial representation of where people might have challenges with different symptoms. And it's never as easy as that, but it's a really great start. So I always work with the client from that point of view. Where's it showing up for you in your life right now? It's dynamic, it might change, but where are we right now? That is a lifesaver for some people because they don't know. They just don't know, and they don't know where to turn. They don't know what to do. So I'll support people through pre-diagnosis, diagnosis, getting to know themselves. And then I will work with them on what they want to do next with their workplace. And again, that's a massive opportunity. And what I find is, I talked a little bit about the anger a lot of people might feel. So you imagine all of that life stuff. I like to think of it as a backpack that's been full of rocks, right? So every time something's happened, you put another rock in your backpack and you're carrying this big heavy load, and you go to your workplace, you say, oh, I've got ADHD. That's a moment that matters massively. So the response in that moment and how it all plays out is huge. So I'll help the individual find the language and the resources to be able to educate their workplace and their manager in that moment. And I also offer to then coach the individual, obviously, and to support them. But I'll also then offer to work with the manager, not to necessarily get a training course on autism or ADHD or any other neurodivergent conditions, because there's many, but also to help them work with that unique individual. And that's what managers should be doing anyway. Managers should be understanding the unique individuals in their team and knowing their strengths and weaknesses, knowing how to best work with them to get the best out of them. That's why managers exist. And so I know from interviewing managers, they're really, really quite fearful in those moments as well. And what tends to happen is they then, as you described, walk on eggshells, and that impacts the individual because they'll go to HR will get involved, and it'll go formal quite quickly. And when I say formal, the language changes from the business. The person starts to get emails instead of like being talked to as a person. They want that the business is showing, whether they mean to or not, that they want all of this in writing. And, this is like quite serious and they don't want to make a mistake. So they default to some really, some different communication methods than they may have used before. So what then happens is fear, mistrust, everything breaks down. And that really can snowball to the point where either the person ends up going off being unwell or, it's just not conducive to kind of what we want to achieve as HR professionals and businesses. And actually, aside from that, there's the law to consider, because there's obviously discrimination involved in that. And there's no cap on discrimination claims. And ADHD and autism aren't automatically seen as a disability in the eyes of the law, like anything. There's not many things that are, but they're likely to be, because they do impact your day-to-day life. And so I help businesses at that point with the individual to reduce the risk, turn it into opportunity, and then I'll work with the team. Because the next step in that journey for the individual is I'm going to, you ask for reasonable adjustments, and I'll help with that as well. And I've trained in that so I can work with workplaces on that. But the individual will start to get special treatment. And what that does then, without the understanding from the team, is creates resentment. I've seen that lots of times. And so what I'll do is I'll actually work with the team on from a neuro-inclusive lens. So I will work with the team, and they will do a workshop with me where they learn all about their own unique differences. And we talk about neurodiversity in its true sense. And then the manager and the business have a toolkit to manage that person and that team as unique individuals. So I've not only helped the neurodivergent individual to continue, help create a better environment for them so they can thrive, but hopefully what I've done is also help the whole team. And the program I run is called Ripple. So I then ripple that outwards and work with the business to try to create a neuro-inclusive environment. And that's when I work with, from an individual's point of view, my focus is always that individual. Mm-hmm. But obviously, in order to help them, I have to help their environment to be able to adapt for them. And so that's how I do that.
That must be so rewarding when organizations do that well.
Yeah. There's so many organizations who really want to as well, but don't know where to start. And they haven't got the expertise either, HR wise or whatever. Time is a factor. And it is when they see the results and you see that breakthrough moment where they get it and they go, oh, wow, this has really changed things for us, then that's really rewarding. And obviously working with that individual is really rewarding as well.
Yeah. No, I can just see, because again, back in my day, I mean, it's it's got a long time now since I've worked in HR. And neurodiversity wasn't even a thing when I was in HR. It didn't exist. We
didn't know what it meant, did we? That long. We didn't know what it meant. Yeah.
No idea. And I can imagine as an HR professional being sat there going, "Wow, okay, what has to happen?" And naturally, as an HR professional, your immediate go-to is, I need to protect the organization. Like, what do I need to do for that? I also need to think, what does this human being in front of me need? And how do I balance and reconcile those two things? And that must be a really scary place to be for an HR professional. And I think that's where you particularly have a really unique set of skills, because you are an experienced senior HR professional. You understand organizational priorities and that side of it. You're a neurodivergent individual, so you also understand what it's like to go through that process. And you, more than anybody, can see how do we bridge that gap and how do we actually do that? Because I'm listening to you talk that through. I'm just sat here thinking, I totally get it now, how isolating that could be for an individual. If you go into your workplace and say, I've got an ADHD diagnosis or whatever, and all of a sudden it goes, like you say, formal. And all of a sudden your work colleagues treat you differently. The organization treats you. Now all of a sudden you're being called into HR to have a formal meeting. And you then become, isolated from everything and everyone that just because you've told them. And I'm like, actually, I've never thought of it like that. But wow,
yeah, that's right. And if it's a really good way of summarising it. And if you think about the journey we talked about with the rocks in the backpack, how much that triggers every fear you ever had. Honestly, it's such a risky area for businesses to get right. And one of the things that I'm starting to do, I'm launching it. It's actually launched, but officially launching it in the next couple of weeks, is a pledge. So organizations can pledge with me to work towards becoming more neurodiverse or neuro-inclusive, as I call it. And I got a framework for that. I walk them through it. It takes the guesswork out of it. They get template kits. They get me. And it's for businesses that are really serious about it and forward thinking, then they really get benefits out of that as well. So like I said, individuals, I am person centric, but the other side of it is I realized that we're going back to environment all the time. The business and the way they operate and the way that they do these things has to be informed and really thought about. And I've been that HR person who's been scared when somebody's come and told me something. I know what it's like. It's you do that, and there's pressure from above to do that as well, and it's really hard for HR people. And a lot of the people I speak to are the HR professionals on this stuff who come and seek my support. So yeah, absolutely.
I love the idea though of creating neuro-inclusive environments. Like that just is what everybody wants, right?
It's easy as well. It's so easy. Like it doesn't cost anything. The bit I think that turns businesses off is the fear of the unknown. And you're getting these reactions coming in as well. So you get this legacy of businesses thinking that neurodivergent people are a problem. But you're going to be a problem if you're getting that experience that you've just really eloquently described. Of course, you're going to be a problem because the way you're being treated, you're going to be angry and all the rest of it, and you're isolated. And so you're bringing, there's just a lot of stuff in that moment that matters, that it's simple stuff, we can make it better. But like low cost stuff, quiet rooms. Who wouldn't benefit from a quiet room where they could go, better signage around the place to let people know exactly what to do, what not to do. Job descriptions that aren't jargony, allowing people to have reasonable adjustments for interview. None of this costs anything. It's just opening your mind up to go, oh yeah, actually, that would work really well for everyone. And then we would be neuro inclusive. We would be including everybody in this. And it's really straightforward to do, but it takes a little bit of unlearning.
Yeah.
One of the reasonable adjustments for recruitment is quite often cited, in fact, and it's taken me a bit of time to get my head around this as a HR person, genuinely now, I'm being completely honest, is that one of the reasonable adjustments that's often requested is to have the interview questions up front. Oh, it blows people, people are just like, what? Interview questions up front? But think about it logically, right? You're not testing for people's ability to recall memories on the spot. And actually, that is one of the things that the executive function in neurodivergence is really common, where, you find stuff like that. You can find stuff like that really difficult. And so you give the questions up front, but you can ask follow-up questions. But imagine everybody walked into an interview with their examples that they could be further questioned on, right? Everyone had exactly the same. And so they were at ease. You could get to know them because they weren't spending the whole time trying to think about, a memory or, think about something to recall in a competency-based interview. And imagine a world where, we had created these interview environments where everybody could be really, really, authentic themselves. How amazing would that be? Because you would be hiring people who you know what you were getting. And that's half the problem. Anyway, I could talk about recruitment forever. As I've always seen it, is a little bit of it's like dating. So you imagine you went on a date with somebody for an hour and talked to them and then said, all right, let's move in together. That's genuinely, that's how it's like, all right, yeah, you seem decent enough. Like you've given some good answers. Let's move in together. You'd never do it, would you? No. So it's like, you have to really test for what you're looking for. And if you're saying that in your organization, you want people who are authentic, and you want to get to know people, and you really want to kind of get the best people and the quality people in, then there's ways to do it that can benefit everybody. But that's a particular one that I know a lot of businesses struggle with. Yeah.
And I would, if you'd said to me, can I have the interview questions up front? My immediate reaction would be, well, no, that's not how an interview works. That's not how it's done. That's not how it's done. But now you explained it like that, I'm like, actually, yeah. Because actually, how often as an HR professional have I interviewed people and you think you've hired one person and then they're a few weeks into the job and then you're like, that's not the person I thought I hired. And actually,
they can think on their feet. Yeah, I've hired someone who can think on their feet, but obviously, and give and be eloquent.
Yeah,
which sounds good and looks good, but can they do the job? And can they? And actually, are they just really good? I'm going to use the word blagging, but are they just really good at that? And I know that, we design interview process, try to kind of look through that. That in particular, I think, would take all that away, because you'd come in with your examples and you'd ask questions about the examples. Yeah. That would be how you got to know them, and you do it in a really relaxed way, and the person be more relaxed and be more themselves. And yeah, you know what you're getting. That's the point of an interview.
Yeah. But you see, I think that's where like the way you've just described that, I'm like, well, yeah, obviously, why have we not done that before? But I think that's the unique skills you have as someone that has, has a foot in both camps, if I can call it that, because you can see it from both points of view, and your journey has further informed you as an HR professional, I'm sure. And yeah, fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Jen, I'm conscious you and I could sit here for hours and talk about all of this, because I find it fascinating, and thank you for being so generous with your knowledge and your expertise, because I know anybody that listens to this episode is going to get massive value. So thank you. One of the things I wanted to pick your brains on is about top tips for coaches. So as you know, we've got a massive community of which you're part of, coaches, master coaches, and I'm not an expert in neurodiversity. It's just not something I've ever done training in. And again, you wear both hats because you are a coach and a master coach, and you're someone that's neurodivergent. So actually, I really wanted to take the opportunity to pick your brains and get some top tips for you. So let's imagine a scenario. One of our coaches in our community is faced with an individual that comes in and says, this is me, and that includes neurodiversity in some way, shape or form. Could you give us some top tips of what to do to be the best coach we can be for a neurodivergent coaching client?
Yes, I definitely can. I'm going to start off, before I go into that, just the golden rule, which we've already touched upon. So if you've met one neurodivergent person, you've met one neurodivergent person. So always begin there. And I think back to some of the stuff we've talked about, my top tip would be that you need to learn and unlearn. So where I go with that is, and again, this has challenged my own kind of preconceived ideas of how things should be. What I love about NLP is that the community is full of curious people who want to do things better. And so, that's what I love about it. And I think there's no better community to talk to about this. So it's just about adjusting our own mindsets as well on this stuff. And where I go with that, just as an example, top tip, if you're working with a client who is neurodivergent, then basically offer lots of different methods of communication from the start. So let them know that you're willing to make adjustments. Make it really clear that you're happy to work on those. So like super clear, be really authentic with that. Now, this, again, it challenges some of the stuff we do. And you might find, let's consider the word reasonable adjustments here, right? And we don't need to do that as coaches, but I quite like it in a lot of ways, because you've got to think about your outcomes, what you're trying to achieve with the client, and you will have talked to them about that. And you've got to think about, well, how can I best achieve that? And with NLP, there's a lot of, and other coaching as well, there's a lot of watching body language. There's a lot of, you want to be building rapport. And we all think the best way to do that is through face-to-face. Now, some neurodivergent individuals, maybe not all the time, might prefer stuff in the written word. They might prefer to, they'll definitely, a lot of people, I think every client I've worked with actually has preferred to know exactly what we're going to be working on up front. And when I say that, it's more about how long is the session going to take? What is going to be involved in the session? And this is what to expect. So, the other thing to consider, cameras on or off. And again, I know that we're all going, oh, wow, that's not something that I'm used to. But actually think about equity. So what you're trying to do is create an environment where the person can be comfortable and can get the best out of the sessions. And that's what we're there to do. And we're there to get the outcome for the client. And so it's really thinking about what we need to do that and how we can achieve it, if that makes sense. So that would be kind of my first one, is ask them what they need, try to work with it. If there's a specific thing where you're like, it really does need to be that I need to see the client for this, explain it and open up the dialogue.
Yeah, got it.
Okay. So number 2, I think it's about building rapport, but doing it their way. So I touched upon this, but building like the rules of engagement into things. So this is what we're going to cover in the sessions. They might prefer that you follow things up in writing. And it's really about kind of getting them to open up and be able to tell you the truth. So, with someone with ADHD, what I found is really difficult to keep the sessions to time, case in point. And whereas then with maybe someone with autism, and again, let's not generalize here, but it's just an example, you might struggle to get an answer from them. They may need to process things. They may need to write them down first before they answer you, which if you're not used to it, can be a bit weird. But also note that facial expressions don't always match what you think they mean. That's part of masking, learning facial expressions that other people do in certain situations. Body language might not match how they're feeling. And I've been caught out myself with clients on that as I've gone on and learned, so it's building that rapport and just asking those questions. If you're not sure on something, just ask.
Yeah. Sounds absolutely makes sense. I'm loving this. I'm like, what else can you tell me?
And I think this is, and again, I think I've talked to you about this before. So you can't always stop the train, right? That's how I'm going to frame this tip. Now, if anyone's been on any of your training, you use this absolutely brilliant graphic of a train at the top of a hill about to go down the hill and gather momentum. And the idea is that what we can do as NLPers is help people develop new strategies so that they can help the train come off the tracks, if you like, and divert and not go down the hill and gather the momentum. So when it comes to emotions and, those emotions building. And I think it's really important to remember that neurodivergent individuals probably are going to struggle with things like emotional regulation. I heard a thing the other day, I loved it, just to explain it further. We wear our nervous systems on the outside of our bodies. So if you think that like an emotion's intense, double it, triple it, and the speed at which it can come out of nowhere is quite scary sometimes. And so it's thinking about when we're working with individuals, if we can't stop the train, being okay with that, and really helping the client then start to understand their sensory nervous systems a bit more and coming up with ways that they can recover from that more quickly. Mm-hmm. So again, you're going to be working with people who've got complex neurodevelopmental differences, and their energy levels and what can be tolerated are going to be very different. So it's checking in often, setting up the rules, making sure that, if they want a break, they can take a break. And it's creating that trust and having maybe a recovery plan in place up front. So if it does go to the point where the train goes off the track after you've tried some work with them, having that plan in place up front and say, right, sensory needs, what is it that what are your sensory preferences as well as the things that make you feel uncomfortable? How are you going to, how can we work to get you back to a resourceful state as quickly as possible? And having that dialogue.
So give me an example of what a recovery plan might sound like.
Okay. So there's many, and again, there's lots of different elements to this. So there's some things that there's definitely some tools that people will have come across as coaches where you might, as an example, part of that whole, the trains gather momentum, you might just really get them to have a worksheet or something that actually helps them to go, where's this thought coming from? Is this thought real? What's the evidence that I've got for this being the case? And, and helping them, it's like a very CBT, although, CBT and neurodivergence, they're not really just designed to go together, but it's about then thinking about how can we get you from having these ruminating thoughts and spiraling to a place where, you might feel better. Another one is special interests. So a lot of neurodivergent individuals have got special interests, and asking them about what they're interested in really usually ignites them and gets them back to a really good state. That can help, and it's also, like I said, like I do stuff with clients called a sensory recovery plan. So what you would do is look at all the different things, like I said, things that maybe make them feel very uncomfortable and things that make them feel comfortable. As an example, loud noises might make them uncomfortable. Strong smells might make them uncomfortable. Just some examples. Whereas listening, sitting under a weighted blanket and listening to their favorite song on repeat over and over again might really comfort them. And so it's thinking about that, like, what is it that helps you? So it's again, back to being Neuro Inclusive. It's the same thing you do with other clients, but you've just got to understand that and be a bit more patient and understand that it's not always something that can be helped when somebody might not be able to stop that train, get that momentum. Can't say the word momentum.
Yeah. No, I get it. And therefore, accepting it can't always be stopped. Then we need a plan for what are we going to do. I was just in my head trying to work out, are we talking about a recovery plan for within the coaching session or a recovery plan as part of something that they might use longer term? I'm guessing it could be either.
It could be either. Yeah, it could be either. So I tend to go more longer term. In the coaching sessions, if it happens, you kind of go with, you're a coach, so you kind of know, you've got to work with the client. You're never going to let them leave the call when they're in any kind of state like that anyway. So you'd always work with them exactly like we've been taught. But what we might do is give them something and some tools outside of the sessions as well to think about.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Got it. Have you got any other little gems?
Yes. So be aware of coexisting conditions.
Okay.
A big one, and one that I found really useful as a coach. So rejection sensitivity dysphoria, okay, RSD, as it's called, is not everyone again, but it's quite common. So what I talked about earlier, where someone with ADHD gets all these negative kind of signals coming at them, you imagine what that does to you. So you kind of think, well, first of all, you just want to do well because you want to gain you want to belong. So you want to gain people's acceptance. And so more than maybe a typical person, you're going to be like a total people pleaser. You're going to really, really struggle with any kind of sense of rejection. All of us do, I think, to some degree, but this is like, the only way I can describe it, it's painful. Okay. It's physically painful when you feel like you've been rejected or you feel like you're about to be rejected. Feedback in the workplace is always an interesting one for that. But, we all know that you get training around that stuff because a lot of people find it difficult. But for someone with RSD, it's like you're talking days and days of like physical pain. And so I think it's really kind of, again, it's going back to that relationship that you build with them. So from my own personal experience, for me in a coaching environment, might be that you do let's say we do a technique, right? I know it's not as straightforward as this. We don't just go, let's do a technique. But let's say you used a technique because you felt like it was something to help the client. You say, where are you at now from scale of 1 to 10? They might want to please you and not tell you that it's still there.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? So it's about kind of really saying to them, look, when you do your pre-frames and when you're talking to the client about this stuff, I'm there to help you. But, maybe more than you would usually, and just saying, please tell me if we want to get it to a 0, but also understanding at the same time, you might not, because of all of the stuff I've talked about with nervous systems being so sensitive. And again, you've got to be led by the client. And then the other thing is overcommitting to actions. That's another one. So going, okay, I'll do all these things in the next week. And where I've talked about the person's battery, another way to, I don't know if anyone will have heard of it, but Spoon's theory is quite a good one to look up, which is more of a clinical intervention and technique. But it's a similar thing where when you set tasks for the client or the client sets tasks for themselves, checking in and just saying, look, what have you got on for the next week? How, thinking about your battery, where do you think that, do you think this is actually realistic? And we do the realistic thing, but it's about framing it around their battery's going to deplete quicker. There's unplanned things that might come in that might throw them off. But it's about showing that understanding that, you know that they might need that little bit of extra battery power. But also, if they don't manage to meet some things or do some things they've committed to, just really being very forgiving and making sure that you're not shaming them at all, even subtly. So, already feel lots of guilt and shame about not meeting things that we said we're going to do. So it's kind of, making sure that, and I think most of us would do this anyway as good coaches, but just making sure that we let them know that it's okay and we'll work on it for next time. Let's look at how did we overcommit? Did we not overcommit? How did it happen? All the stuff you would do to investigate maybe why it didn't happen. But in a non-judgmental way, not even in your tone.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's just what you're doing is shining a light on practices that we would do anyway, but just shining a neurodiversity or neuroinclusive lens on it and go, actually, yeah, I can totally see how that would happen, because you've done such a great job in explaining it all. Now you're going through these tips. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. If we hadn't have had the discussion we've had, I probably would have gone, really? But it makes sense. It does absolutely make sense.
And you know what, like the final tip is work with their brain. So again, I'm trying to come up with examples for this that are meaningful. And one of the things that resonated for me was, think of the medical profession when they say to somebody, like, score your pain from a 0 to a 10, because we use rating scales a lot in coaching. And if you were talking to some neurodivergent individuals, they would imagine 10, right, as the most catastrophic thing you could ever imagine in your entire life. It would be like, unrivaled pain. And so in that context, you can see maybe how that could cause a problem for the person in getting the right treatment. So it's no different, really. I think I got trained in executive coaching to be really pushy with this. So, where are you on the scale? How committed are you? Oh, an 8. Right. How do we get you to a 10? So it's not about that. It's about, first of all, saying, let's get you up a little bit. Where do you feel comfortable? And like doing it that way. That's one way. And then the other way is to, and be careful with this, obviously, have your recovery plans and things, but elicit, let's say you were talking about anxiety. What's your anxiety levels today? 0 to 10. Elicit maybe the most anxious they've ever felt and say, that's your 10. So they understand what we're talking about. Yeah. And like, you can, like, they've got a reference point and you've got a reference point, and you know that you're working within a realistic kind of boundary. And I just think it's, there's so many, again, a lot of individuals struggle with like introspection, where they don't necessarily understand the signals their bodies are giving them. And we know that, sometimes find it really hard to identify emotions. So it's being, the word of the day is patience and understanding and just building that trust. But it's also, knowing then when, as a coach, to refer them and to signpost them maybe somewhere else. So that's the really key thing, unless so I'm trained in ADHD coaching and I'm trained in ATTA, which is an autistic clinical practice that you can use in coaching. So I'm trained in both of those. And I think it's just about, you can work with clients, absolutely. But if there's a point where, like we all would again, back to good practice that we're taught, know when to signpost them to either a specialist coach or to a therapist, which is, again, you teach us that anyway, and that's exactly the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, that's just good practice, right? You stay within your scope of skills, knowledge, and experience. And I say that if I said it once on a course, I said it 1,000 times on a course.
Exactly.
And not being afraid as a coach to actually open up. I think that's the other thing. I think sometimes as coaches, we want to have this persona of we know everything and that we've got it. And actually, part of that trusting relationship you build with a client, and that what I call an adult to adult culture relationship, is being able to openly and honestly turn up and say, I've not come across this before. I'm going to need to look into this. Or I just need to let you know that I think we've stepped outside of my scope of skills, knowledge, and experience. Let me find someone else that I think might be more skilled and able to help you. And having the courage to do that, I think is, like you say, it's key.
Absolutely.
Oh my, there's some absolute gems there. And thank you so much for sharing that, because I know it will help me and I know it will help everybody else. I mean, as you can imagine, I'm going to be telling everybody they need to listen to this podcast episode, because I just think you've given so much value today for someone that is new to this area in whatever capacity. There's gems here in terms of if you're a parent, you're an employer, you're a coach. There's so much that you've given, and I'm so grateful for your time and for you sharing all of that knowledge with us. I know you're going to help thousands of people, because as you know, this podcast goes globally. So there's thousands of people that are going to get to benefit from your experience. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you.
Now, if someone wants to reach out to you and wants to get in contact with you, maybe they're an HR professional that might want your expertise in their organisation, or they are an individual who is, an adult that's just had a diagnosis or whatever, and they want your one-to-one support. What is the best way for people to get in contact with you?
So the best way is going to be via email, because I'm really old school. So it's my email address is Jennifer, so it's JENNIFER @thinkdiff.uk. You can check out the website obviously as well. So that's www.thinkdiff.uk. I am on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Instagram. My handle is ThinkDiff Neurodivergent Coach. Same for Facebook, and my LinkedIn is just Jennifer Griffiths if you want to search for me there.
Fab. And just for people listening to the podcast today, ThinkDiff, you spell it ThinkDiff. So it's one F. Okay. Because some of us are a little bit, down, won't put two F's on the end. So ThinkDiff, all one word, ThinkDiff if you're listening to this episode, and do go and check out Jen's stuff and reach out to her if she can be of service to you. So thanks, Jen. Now, final part of the podcast episode. Regular listeners of the podcast will know we do a quick fire round at the very, very end. Jen has absolutely no idea the questions I'm going to ask, and I'm just going to fire a couple of questions at her, and we're going to see what pearls of wisdom come to her head. And I did check before she was happy to do this. So, so here we go. Right, drum roll, here we go. So, if you could write anything on a billboard in your local town or city, what would you want to write on it?
Oh, wow. Look, I'm going to stick with the neurodiversity thing here. And it would be think differently about people who think differently.
Love it. Absolutely, absolutely love it. What is the most misunderstood thing about your area of expertise?
I think it's probably that people think it's a trend. So there appears to be more people coming forward with diagnosis, and there is, but percentage-wise in the population, it's not. And we've already talked about, people getting missed. That's men and women. And let's not forget, there's socioeconomic elements to this, and there's also gender, race. There's a lot that comes into this. And so, it's with more awareness, people are actually getting the help they need. And what can be wrong with that? Like that's my take on it.
Absolutely. I love it. I'm just looking down through my list. If you could have dinner with any famous person, past or present, who would you want to sit down and have dinner with?
Do you know when something just pops in your head and you think, what? But I'm going with it because I am. So Jane Austen.
Cool. Yeah.
Down with, I know that's like, you think see Gandhi or, maybe someone, but Jane Austen, I just would love to talk to her.
Oh my God. Yeah, absolutely. Just imagine the stories that she'd have to tell.
Questions, like you want to know more about her and like where it all came, because she tells such amazing stories. Definitely.
If you could give one piece of advice to your younger self, so back to your teenage years or something like that, if you could give yourself one pearl of advice, what would it be?
Don't worry. You're going to be okay, and you're going to do some good in the world with this.
Yeah,
that would be, and because when you're a teen, it's like you're not always sure, are you? It's a horrible time anyway. So I think it would be that, and it would be, I'd probably give myself a massive hug, and they'd be the things I do.
I love it. Absolutely love it. Amazing. Jen, thank you so much for your time, for sharing all of your knowledge with you. I know you're going to help thousands and thousands of people with this podcast episode, either because they come directly to this podcast and hear your expertise, or because they hear your expertise and it impacts those other people that are out there. And your idea of the ripple effect is just phenomenal. And I know you're going to do amazing things with all of this. So big love to you. And thank you so much for your time And wishing everybody that's listening to the podcast an amazing day, month and year. And I will be back with another episode very soon. The next episode of NLP Talks is going to be a deep dive session with just me. So watch out for that. Will be coming very, very soon. So take care all. Goodbye.